Marcus Thompson had always been the type of person who pushed boundaries. At 28 years old, the American tourist from Denver had a reputation among his friends for taking things just a little too far. Whether it was climbing over barriers at national parks for the perfect photo, or haggling with street vendors until they walked away in frustration, Marcus seemed to believe that rules were more like suggestions. This particular Thursday morning in London started like any other day of his European vacation. Marcus had been traveling through Europe for 3 weeks, documenting every moment on his social media accounts. His followers loved his bold content, and the likes and comments had been pouring in. Each post seemed to outdo the last, and Marcus was constantly thinking about how to make his content more exciting and shareable. The weather was typical London grey, with a light drizzle that made the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace glisten under the overcast sky. Marcus approached the famous residence with his phone already in hand, snapping photos and recording short videos as he walked. The palace grounds were buzzing with tourists from all corners of the world, their cameras clicking and voices chattering in dozens of different languages. Marcus noticed immediately how the crowd seemed to maintain a respectful distance from the royal guards stationed at their posts. These weren't just any security personnel. These were the Queen's Guard, elite soldiers from some of Britain's most prestigious regiments. They stood perfectly still in their iconic red tunics and towering black bearskin hats, their faces expressionless and their eyes fixed straight ahead. The guard closest to where Marcus stood was particularly imposing. Standing at least 6 feet tall, his uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection. His rifle was held at precisely the correct angle, and despite the dozens of tourists taking photos just feet away, he remained as motionless as a statue. This was Guardsman James Mitchell, a 24-year-old soldier from the Coldstream Guards who had been serving at Buckingham Palace for 8 months. Marcus watched other tourists approach the guard, taking selfies from what seemed like a safe distance. Some tried to get the guard's attention by waving or making funny faces, but the soldier remained completely unmoved. This display of discipline and professionalism was exactly what made the Queen's Guard so famous around the world. But to Marcus, it looked like a challenge. He pulled out his phone and started recording a video for his Instagram story. Speaking into the camera with the palace in the background, he said, "Okay guys, so I'm here at Buckingham Palace, and everyone's talking about how these guards never move, never react to anything. I've been watching for like 10 minutes, and honestly, I think people are exaggerating. I mean, they're just people doing a job, right?" Marcus had been building up to this moment throughout his entire trip. His social media following had grown from a few hundred to several thousand, as he documented increasingly daring stunts and boundary-pushing moments. There was the time he climbed onto a restricted monument in Paris, or when he snuck into a private garden in Rome for photos. Each incident had gained him more followers and more engagement, feeding his desire for online validation. As he continued filming, Marcus began walking closer to Guardsman Mitchell. The other tourists around him seemed to sense that something was about to happen, and a few people stopped to watch. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, pointing at the American tourist who was clearly planning something that the adults recognized as potentially problematic. The morning crowd was particularly dense, with several tour groups having arrived simultaneously. The guides were pointing out various features of the palace and explaining the history and traditions of the royal guards. One guide, an elderly British woman named Mrs. Patterson who had been conducting tours for over 15 years, noticed Marcus's approach and felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had seen this type of tourist behavior before, and it never ended well. Marcus was now standing just 3 feet from Guardsman Mitchell, his phone held up and recording. He could see the guard's face clearly now. Young, serious, with piercing blue eyes that stared straight ahead. The guard's breathing was so controlled that his chest barely moved, and Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by the level of discipline on display. But rather than deterring him, this only made him more determined to get a reaction. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people sensing that they were about to witness something unusual. A few concerned tourists began whispering among themselves, and one elderly gentleman was overheard saying to his wife, "That young man is going to get himself in trouble if he's not careful." Marcus stepped even closer, now just 18 inches from the guard. He could smell the leather of the soldier's uniform and see the individual hairs of the bearskin hat. Guardsman Mitchell's jaw was set firmly, and although his eyes remained fixed ahead, Marcus could sense the tension in the soldier's posture. The guard was very much aware of the tourist's proximity and was prepared for whatever might come next. The American tourist raised his phone higher, making sure to capture both himself and the guard in the frame. His followers were going to love this content. He had already gained over 200 new followers just from his London posts, and he was confident that whatever happened next would push him over the 5,000 follower mark he had been chasing. What Marcus didn't fully understand was that he was not just approaching any costumed performer or tourist attraction. Guardsman Mitchell was an active-duty soldier who had trained extensively not just in ceremonial duties, but in combat and security procedures. The seemingly decorative rifle he carried was very real, and the guard was authorized to use significant force if necessary to protect the royal residence and maintain security. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Marcus a harsh lesson about respect, boundaries, and the serious nature of British royal protocol. Marcus decided to test the waters gradually. He started by making exaggerated facial expressions just inches from Guardsman Mitchell's face, pulling silly faces and sticking his tongue out while recording himself. The crowd behind him was growing larger, with some people looking uncomfortable while others seemed entertained by the spectacle. A group of teenage tourists from Germany began giggling and encouraging Marcus, not fully understanding the gravity of what they were witnessing. Guardsman Mitchell remained perfectly still, his training taking over completely. He had dealt with countless tourists over his months of service, and he knew exactly what protocol demanded of him. His superior officers had drilled into all the guards that maintaining composure was not just about tradition, it was about national security and protecting the dignity of the crown. Every guard understood that they were representing not just themselves, but the entire British military and the royal family. Marcus grew bolder, interpreting the guard's lack of reaction as weakness rather than professional discipline. He began making jokes to his phone camera, saying things like, "I don't think this guy's even real. Maybe he's just a really good wax figure." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small snack and a bag of chips he had bought earlier, and began eating them, loudly right next to the guards. Hear the sound of Marcus crunching chips just inches from his head tested even Guardsman Mitchell's exceptional training. The soldier's nostrils flared slightly, the only sign that he was aware of and annoyed by the tourist's behavior. This tiny reaction was not lost on some of the more observant members of the crowd, including Mrs. Patterson, the tour guide, who recognized it as a warning sign. Mrs. Patterson approached the edge of the crowd and tried to catch Marcus's attention. "Excuse me, young man," she called out in her crisp British accent. "You really should step back and give the guard some space. There are rules about how close tourists can get." But Marcus was too caught up in his performance to pay attention to her warnings. His phone was recording, his followers would be watching soon, and he was determined to create content that would go viral. The American tourist then made his first major mistake. He reached out and actually touched Guardsman Mitchell's uniform, brushing a pretend piece of lint off the red tunic while saying to his camera, just helping him look his best for all the photos. The moment Marcus's fingers made contact with the guard's uniform, something shifted in the atmosphere around them. Guardsman Mitchell's entire body tensed, though he still didn't move from his position. However, other guards stationed nearby had noticed the physical contact, and according to their protocols, touching a guard or their equipment was a serious breach of security. Two additional guards who had been positioned further away began a slow but deliberate movement toward the scene. Marcus was oblivious to the approaching guards, too focused on his phone screen and the reactions he was getting from the crowd. Some tourists were now openly expressing concern, with several parents pulling their children further back. A businessman from Japan who had been watching the scene unfold was shaking his head disapprovingly and muttering under his breath about disrespectful Americans. The second major escalation came when Marcus decided to pose for what he thought would be the perfect selfie. He turned his back to Guardsman Mitchell and held his phone up high, pressing himself back against the guard's chest and rifle for the photo. This was not just touching the guard's uniform. This was making physical contact with both the soldier and his weapon, which represented a significant security threat in the eyes of palace security. For Guardsman Mitchell, this was the final straw. The protocols were clear. Any tourist who made contact with a guard's weapon or attempted to interfere with their duties was to be dealt with immediately and decisively. The young soldier had been patient, professional, and restrained, but Marcus had crossed every line there was to cross. The crowd sensed the change immediately. The air seemed to crackle with tension as Guardsman Mitchell prepared to act. Several tourists instinctively stepped backward, and the clicking of camera shutters intensified as people realized they were about to witness something significant. Mrs. Patterson clasped her hands together nervously and whispered, oh dear, this is not going to end well." Marcus was still adjusting his position for the perfect selfie angle when he felt the unmistakable sensation of cold steel against his back. Guardsman Mitchell had shifted his rifle's position slightly, making it clear to the tourist that he was armed and ready to use his weapon if necessary. But Marcus, still focused on his phone screen, misinterpreted this as the guard accommodating his photo request. "Thanks for being such a good sport about this," Marcus said cheerfully to the camera, still pressed against the guard. "I told you guys these guards are just regular people doing their jobs. They're actually pretty cool about tourists getting close for photos." He had no idea how wrong he was about to be proven. The two additional guards who had been approaching were now just 20 feet away, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They had radioed for additional security, and somewhere in the palace's security center, supervisors were watching the situation unfold on multiple camera feeds. What had started as a minor tourist incident was rapidly escalating into a security situation that would require immediate and decisive action. Marcus finally turned around to face Guardsman Mitchell, expecting to see the same emotionless expression he'd been looking at for the past several minutes. Instead, he found himself staring into the eyes of a highly trained soldier who had reached the absolute limit of his patience and was now prepared to demonstrate exactly why the Queen's Guard was not to be trifled with. The tourist's confident smile began to fade as he realized that something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic between them. The guard's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead, were now locked directly onto Marcus's face with an intensity that made the American's stomach drop. For the first time since approaching the guard, Marcus began to understand that he might have made a serious mistake. The transformation in Guardsman Mitchell was instantaneous and terrifying. In one fluid motion that took less than 2 seconds, the soldier stepped forward, brought his rifle to port arms position, and bellowed in a voice that could be heard 3 blocks away, "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." The sheer volume and authority of the guard's voice hit Marcus like a physical force. Every tourist within a 50-foot radius jumped backward, and several children began crying from the shock of the sudden, thunderous command. Marcus stumbled backward, his phone nearly slipping from his trembling hands as he came face to face with the reality of what he had been treating as entertainment. Guardsman Mitchell's voice continued to boom across the palace grounds. "Do not touch the Queen's Guard. Do not obstruct the Queen's Guard. Stand back!" The young soldier's training had taken over completely, and his voice carried the full weight of military authority and centuries of royal protocol. This was not a tourist attraction. Having a bad day, this was a highly trained soldier doing exactly what he had been trained to do when someone crossed the line. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 100 people, all of whom were now backing away rapidly while keeping their cameras and phones trained on the unfolding scene. Social media notifications were already beginning to ping as people started uploading videos and photos of the confrontation in real time. Within minutes, the hashtags Buckingham Palace and Royal Guard would begin trending. Marcus's face had gone completely white, and his confident social media personality crumbled in an instant. The guard's shouting had been so unexpected and so powerful that the American tourist found himself unable to speak or move. His hands were shaking as he held his phone, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was nothing like the reaction he had expected or prepared for, but Guardsman Mitchell was not finished. The soldier took another step forward, his rifle now held across his chest in a position that made it clear he was prepared to use it if necessary. His voice remained at full volume as he continued, "You will move back immediately. This is your final warning." The guard's face, which had been expressionless moments before, now showed the focused intensity of a professional soldier who would not tolerate any further nonsense. The 2 additional guards who had been approaching were now flanking Marcus on either side, creating a triangle formation that left the tourist with nowhere to go except backward. These soldiers moved with the same precision and authority as Guardsman Mitchell, their own rifles at the ready. The situation had escalated from a tourist photo opportunity to a coordinated military response in less than 30 seconds. Marcus finally found his voice, but it came out as a stammering whisper. I didn't mean... His words were completely overwhelmed by the continued shouting of the guards, and he realized that any attempt at explanation or apology was pointless. The soldiers were not interested in his excuses or his social media followers. They were focused entirely on removing what they perceived as a security threat. Mrs. Patterson, the tour guide who had tried to warn Marcus earlier, was now shepherding her group away from the scene while shaking her head sadly. She had seen dozens of similar incidents over her years of conducting tours, but they never failed to shock her with their suddenness and intensity. "This is why we tell people to be respectful," she muttered to her group. "These are real soldiers, not performers." The palace security cameras had captured every moment of the incident, and supervisors in the security center were already reviewing the footage and coordinating with local police. What Marcus didn't realize was that his behavior had triggered multiple levels of security response, from the immediate action of the guards to potential legal consequences that could affect the rest of his vacation and his ability to travel internationally in the future. Palace security officers in civilian clothes began appearing at the edges of the crowd, their presence subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. These were not the ceremonial guards that tourists came to see. These were modern security professionals with training in crowd control, threat assessment, and international incident management. Marcus had managed to attract the attention of some very serious people in a very short amount of time. The American tourist's phone was still recording, capturing every moment of his humiliation for posterity. The confident, boundary-pushing content creator who had approached the guard just minutes earlier was now a trembling, embarrassed young man who desperately wanted to disappear. His followers would indeed see this video, but not in the way he had planned. Guardsman Mitchell maintained his aggressive posture for another full minute, ensuring that Marcus and everyone else in the vicinity understood that the situation was completely under the guard's control. The soldier's training had prepared him for exactly this type of confrontation, and he executed his response with textbook precision. Every movement, every word, every gesture was designed to establish dominance and eliminate any threat to the security of the royal residence. The crowd continued to film and photograph the scene, but now their focus had shifted from entertainment to documentation of what appeared to be a serious security incident. Parents held their children closer, and several elderly tourists were openly expressing shock at the intensity of the guards' response. Some visitors began leaving the area entirely, uncomfortable with the tension and unsure whether the situation might escalate further. Marcus stood frozen in place, completely overwhelmed by the reality of what he had triggered. The playful tourist stunt that he had expected would gain him social media fame had instead exposed him to the full force of British royal security protocol. He was beginning to understand that his actions had consequences far beyond anything he had imagined when he first approached the guard with his phone in hand. As the echoes of Guardsman Mitchell's commands faded across the palace courtyard, an eerie silence settled over the crowd. Marcus remained frozen, his face pale and his hands visibly trembling as he clutched his phone. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in, but the full extent of what he had triggered was still unfolding around him. From seemingly nowhere, 4 palace security officers in dark suits materialized at the edges of the crowd. These men and women moved with quiet efficiency, their trained eyes scanning the scene and assessing potential risks. Unlike the ceremonial guards with their bright red uniforms and traditional weapons, these security professionals carried modern equipment and had the authority to detain, arrest, and remove threats from the palace grounds. Inspector Sarah Collins, a 20-year veteran of palace security, approached Marcus with measured steps. Her voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority as she addressed the stunned tourist. "Sir, I need you to lower your phone and step away from the guard immediately. You are in violation of several security protocols, and we need to have a conversation about your behavior." Marcus looked around desperately, as if hoping to find an escape route or someone who might help him explain that this was all just a misunderstanding. Instead, he saw hundreds of tourists staring at him, their phones and cameras capturing his humiliation from every angle. The social media content he had been so eager to create was indeed being recorded, but he was no longer in control of the narrative. I didn't know, Marcus stammered, his American accent now seeming to emphasize his status as an outsider who had violated local customs. I was just taking pictures like everyone else. I didn't mean any harm. His voice was barely audible, a stark contrast to the confident tone he had used while recording his videos just minutes earlier. Inspector Collins gestured toward a less crowded area near the palace railings. Please come with me, sir. We need to discuss this situation away from the crowd. It wasn't really a request. Marcus could see additional security officers positioning themselves to ensure he had no choice but to comply. The tourist who had thought he was pushing boundaries for entertainment had instead found himself at the center of a serious security incident. As Marcus was being led away, Guardsman Mitchell remained in his aggressive stance for several more minutes, ensuring that the message was clear to every other tourist in the vicinity. The young soldier's display of force had been textbook perfect, swift, decisive, and overwhelming enough to eliminate any threat while serving as a deterrent to others who might consider similar behavior. The crowd began to disperse slowly, with many visitors clearly shaken by what they had witnessed. Parents explained to their children why the guards had reacted so strongly, while tour groups huddled around their guides for clarification about royal protocol and security procedures. Mrs. Patterson found herself fielding dozens of questions from nervous tourists who wanted to understand exactly what rules they needed to follow to avoid similar confrontations. Meanwhile, in the Palace Security Center, supervisors were reviewing multiple camera angles of the incident and coordinating with various departments. Marcus's behavior had triggered protocols that extended far beyond the immediate response of the guards. Immigration authorities would be notified, the American embassy would be contacted, and a full report would be filed that could affect Marcus's ability to travel internationally in the future. Inspector Collins led Marcus to a small security office adjacent to the main palace grounds. The room was sterile and official, with monitoring equipment lining the walls and a single metal desk in the center. As Marcus sat down in the uncomfortable chair, he began to realize that this was not going to end with a simple warning or a request to leave the premises. Let me explain what just happened, Inspector Collins began, her tone professional but firm. You physically contacted a member of the Queen's Guard, interfered with his duties, and made contact with his weapon. These are serious offenses that we cannot simply overlook. The guards you encountered are not performers or tourist attractions. They are active military personnel responsible for protecting one of the most important buildings in the United Kingdom. Marcus's face grew even paler as the inspector continued. Your actions were recorded by multiple security cameras, and we have dozens of witness accounts from other tourists. This is not a matter of cultural misunderstanding. This is a clear violation of established security protocols that are posted in multiple languages throughout the palace grounds. The American tourist tried to speak, but Inspector Collins held up her hand to stop him. Before you say anything, you should understand that we are required to file a full incident report with multiple agencies. This includes immigration services, who will be notified that you have been involved in a security incident at a royal residence. Depending on the severity of our assessment, this could affect your current visa status and your ability to enter the United Kingdom in the future. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the full implications of his actions began to become clear. What had started as a quest for social media followers was now threatening to have real, lasting consequences for his life. He thought about his job back in Denver, his planned future travels, and the possibility that his few minutes of boundary-pushing behavior might follow him for years to come. Inspector Collins pulled out a tablet and began entering information about the incident. We'll need to see your passport and visa documentation, and you'll need to provide a full statement about what you were doing and why. I should also inform you that we've contacted the local police, who may want to speak with you depending on how we classify this incident. The security office felt like it was closing in around Marcus as he realized that he was no longer just a tourist who had gotten carried away with his social media content. He was now officially a person of interest in a security incident at one of the most heavily protected locations in the world. And the professional demeanor of Inspector Collins made it clear that this was a situation that would be handled with complete seriousness. Outside, Guardsman Mitchell had returned to his original position, once again standing perfectly still and staring straight ahead. To casual observers, it was as if nothing had happened, but other guards and security personnel knew that the young soldier had performed his duties exactly as he had been trained to do. The incident would be noted in his service record as a successful response to a security threat, rather than as any kind of overreaction or mistake. As Marcus sat in the sterile security office, Inspector Collins methodically went through the process of documenting every aspect of the incident. The American tourist watched in growing horror as she filled out form after form, each one seemingly more official and serious than the last. His hands had stopped shaking, but they were now clammy with cold sweat, as the reality of his situation continued to sink in. "Your full name and passport number, please," Inspector Collins requested, her pen poised over yet another official document. Marcus fumbled through his backpack to find his passport, his movements clumsy and nervous. When he handed it over, the inspector examined it carefully, cross-referencing the information with her computer system and making additional notes on her forms. While the inspector worked, Marcus found himself replaying the events of the morning in his mind. He thought about the moment he had first approached Guardsman Mitchell, remembering how confident and excited he had felt about creating content for his social media accounts. That version of himself now seemed like a different person, entirely someone naive and reckless, who had no understanding of the serious nature of royal protocol and security procedures. "I need to ask you about your intentions," Inspector Collins said, looking up from her paperwork. "Did you plan this behavior in advance, or was it a spontaneous decision? Had you researched the guards or the palace security procedures before your visit today?" Marcus realized that his answer could potentially make his situation even worse, as admitting to premeditation might suggest a more serious security threat. "It was spontaneous," Marcus replied honestly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been posting content about my trip on social media, and I thought it would be interesting to see if I could get a reaction from one of the guards. I never intended to cause any real problems or security issues. I just thought it would be funny content for my followers." Inspector Collins made additional notes, her expression remaining neutral but professional throughout the questioning. "How many followers do you have on your social media accounts? And have you posted similar content involving security personnel or restricted areas during your travels?" The questions made Marcus realize that his online presence was now part of an official investigation, and everything he had posted during his European vacation would likely be scrutinized. Meanwhile, outside the security office, the incident was continuing to generate ripple effects throughout the palace grounds and beyond. Videos of the confrontation were already spreading across social media platforms, with dozens of different angles and perspectives being shared by tourists who had witnessed the event. The hashtags related to the incident were gaining momentum, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. British news websites were running headlines like "American Tourist Confronts Royal Guard at Buckingham Palace" and "Security Incident at Palace Draws International Attention." The story was being framed, not just as a single tourist's poor judgment, but as part of a broader pattern of visitors treating royal guards and ceremonial duties as entertainment rather than serious military service. Back in the security office, Inspector Collins was explaining the next steps in the process. "We'll need to contact the American embassy to inform them that one of their citizens has been involved in a security incident. This is standard protocol, but it means that your embassy will have a record of this event. Depending on how our investigation proceeds, they may need to provide you with consular assistance." Marcus felt another wave of panic wash over him as he realized that his actions were now involving diplomatic channels and international relations. What had started as a quest for social media fame was becoming an increasingly complex situation with potential ramifications far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The inspector continued reviewing the incident report, occasionally asking Marcus to clarify specific details or confirm certain facts. "According to multiple witness accounts and our security footage, you made physical contact with Guardsman Mitchell's uniform and rifle. Can you explain exactly what you were thinking when you decided to touch a military weapon while it was being carried by an active duty soldier?" This question hit Marcus particularly hard because it forced him to confront just how reckless his behavior had been. Touching someone's military equipment was clearly inappropriate in any context, But doing so at one of the most secure locations in Britain while that person was actively on duty seemed almost incomprehensibly foolish in retrospect. "I wasn't thinking," Marcus admitted, his voice filled with genuine regret. "I was so focused on creating content and getting a reaction that I wasn't considering the serious nature of what I was doing. I realize now that I treated a real soldier like he was some kind of performer or attraction, and I'm genuinely sorry for that disrespect." Inspector Collins noted his statement of regret, but her expression made it clear that apologies alone would not resolve the situation. "The guards you encountered today are members of elite military units with extensive training in both ceremonial duties and combat situations. When you made contact with Guardsman Mitchell's weapon, he was required by protocol to treat you as a potential security threat. His response was measured and appropriate given the circumstances." The inspector's explanation helped Marcus understand why the guard's reaction had been so swift and overwhelming. Guardsman Mitchell hadn't been overreacting or showing off. He had been following specific protocols designed to protect both the royal residents and the general public from potential threats. Marcus's behavior had forced the guard to treat him as exactly that kind of threat, regardless of his actual intentions. As the formal questioning continued, Marcus found himself thinking about the guard he had confronted. He wondered what Guardsman Mitchell had been thinking during those moments when the tourist was touching his uniform and weapon, and whether the young soldier had been genuinely concerned about a potential security threat or simply frustrated by another disrespectful tourist. Either way, Marcus was beginning to understand that his actions had put both of them in an extremely difficult and potentially dangerous situation. After nearly 2 hours of questioning and paperwork, Inspector Collins finally set down her pen and looked directly at Marcus. The American tourist had been sitting in the uncomfortable metal chair for what felt like an eternity, watching as his few minutes of reckless behavior generated an enormous amount of official documentation and investigation. His back ached, his throat was dry, and his mind was reeling from the potential consequences he was facing. "Mr. Thompson," Inspector Collins began, using Marcus's full name from his passport, "I'm going to explain what happens next. Based on our assessment of the incident, we're classifying this as a Level 2 security breach. This means that while we don't believe you posed a genuine threat to the royal residence or its occupants, your actions were serious enough to warrant significant consequences." Marcus felt his stomach clench as she continued. "You'll be issued with an official warning and placed on a restricted visitor list for all royal properties in the United Kingdom. This means that if you attempt to visit Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, or any other royal residence during the remainder of your stay in Britain, you will be denied entry and potentially arrested." The inspector pulled out a formal document and began filling in Marcus's information. "Additionally, we're required to file a report with Immigration Services. While this incident alone is unlikely to result in your immediate deportation, it will be noted on your record and could affect future visa applications or entry to the UK. If you're involved in any other incidents during your remaining time in Britain, this will be taken into consideration." Marcus watched in silent horror as Inspector Collins completed the paperwork that would officially document his poor judgment for years to come. The social media followers he had been so eager to impress now seemed completely insignificant compared to the real-world consequences of his actions. He thought about trying to explain once again that it had all been a misunderstanding, but he could see that the time for explanations had passed. "There's one more thing," Inspector Collins continued, her tone becoming slightly more personal. "I want you to understand something about the guards you encountered today. Guardsman Mitchell, the soldier you approached, is a decorated member of the Coldstream Guards. He served tours of duty in Afghanistan and has been awarded commendations for valor under fire. When you treated him like a tourist attraction, you weren't just disrespecting a ceremonial figure. You were disrespecting a combat veteran who has risked his life in service to his country." This information hit Marcus harder than any of the official consequences he had been told about. He had been so focused on creating entertaining content that he had never considered the real person behind the uniform, let alone the possibility that the guard might be a genuine war hero who deserved respect rather than harassment from tourists seeking social media attention. "Inspector." Collins handed Marcus the completed documentation and a copy of the official warning. "You're free to leave now, but I strongly suggest you spend the rest of your time in London, being more mindful of local customs and showing appropriate respect for British institutions. The incident this morning has been recorded by dozens of tourists, and videos are already circulating online. You may find that your behavior has consequences beyond our official response. As Marcus left the security office and walked back toward the palace gates, he could feel the stares of other tourists who recognized him from the earlier confrontation. Some people were pointing and whispering, while others held up their phones to record his walk of shame. The confident social media personality who had approached the guard that morning had been replaced by a humbled and embarrassed young man who just wanted to disappear. The irony was not lost on him that his quest for viral content had indeed made him internet famous, but not in the way he had intended. Videos of his confrontation with Guardsman Mitchell were being shared thousands of times across various platforms, but the comments were overwhelmingly critical of his behavior. Rather than gaining admiring followers, he was becoming known as an example of entitled tourist behavior and cultural insensitivity. Marcus pulled out his phone to check his social media accounts and immediately regretted it. His follower count had indeed increased dramatically, but the new followers were mostly there to mock him rather than admire his content. The comments on his posts were brutal, with people from around the world criticizing his disrespectful behavior and lack of understanding about British culture and military tradition. One comment particularly stung. "Imagine being so desperate for attention that you harass a soldier who has served his country with honor. This is embarrassing for all Americans traveling abroad." Another read, "The guard showed incredible restraint. In some countries, touching a soldier's weapon would get you shot, not just shouted at." As Marcus walked through the streets of London back to his hotel, he found himself seeing the city differently than he had that morning. The confident tourist who had been eager to push boundaries and create viral content was gone, replaced by someone who was genuinely ashamed of his behavior and worried about the long-term consequences of his actions. He passed other tourists taking respectful photos with British soldiers and police officers, maintaining appropriate distances and showing genuine appreciation for their service. These interactions looked so simple and natural that Marcus couldn't understand how he had gotten things so wrong just a few hours earlier. The difference between respectful tourism and entitled boundary pushing now seemed glaringly obvious. When Marcus finally reached his hotel room, he sat on the bed and stared at his phone for a long time before deciding to record one final video. This time, however, his tone was completely different from the confident, boundary-pushing persona he had been cultivating throughout his trip. "I need to address what happened at Buckingham Palace today," he began, his voice quiet and serious. "I made a huge mistake and I want to take full responsibility for my actions. I treated a real soldier like he was some kind of entertainment, and that was completely wrong and disrespectful." Marcus continued his apology video, explaining that he had learned about Guardsman Mitchell's military service and commendations, and expressing genuine regret for his behavior. "I came to London thinking I was just creating fun content, but I ended up disrespecting someone who has served his country with honor. That's not who I want to be, and it's not the kind of content I want to be known for." The video was a stark contrast to his usual social media content, but it represented a genuine moment of growth and self-reflection. Marcus realized that his pursuit of online validation had led him to treat real people as props in his personal performance, and that this approach to travel and content creation was fundamentally flawed. He spent the rest of his evening researching the history and traditions of the Queen's Guard, learning about the rigorous training and selection process that soldiers like Guardsman Mitchell had to complete to earn their positions. The more he learned, the more ashamed he felt about his earlier behavior, but also the more determined he became to use this experience as a learning opportunity. Marcus also looked up information about respectful tourism and cultural sensitivity, realizing that his approach to travel had been focused more on his own entertainment than on genuine appreciation for the places and people he was visiting. The incident at Buckingham Palace had forced him to confront the fact that his social media persona was encouraging exactly the kind of behavior that made Americans abroad look entitled and disrespectful. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus Thompson sat in his apartment in Denver, looking back on what had become a defining moment in his life. The videos of his confrontation with Guardsman Mitchell had indeed gone viral, but not in the way he had originally intended. Instead of making him internet famous for his boldness, they had made him a cautionary tale about disrespectful tourist behavior and the consequences of treating cultural institutions as personal entertainment. The immediate aftermath of the incident had been difficult to navigate. Marcus had cut his European vacation short by a week, partly because he was no longer comfortable being recognized by other tourists, and partly because the official warning from palace security had made him genuinely worried about getting into additional trouble. The remaining days of his trip had been spent in quiet reflection, rather than the boundary-pushing content creation that had characterized his earlier travels. When Marcus returned to Denver, he found that the story had followed him home. Local news outlets had picked up the international coverage of his confrontation with the Royal Guard, and several of his co-workers had seen the videos circulating on social media. The attention was embarrassing, but it also forced him to have conversations about respect, cultural sensitivity, and the responsibilities that come with representing your country while traveling abroad. His employer, a marketing firm that valued cultural awareness and international relations, had been understanding but firm in their response to the incident. While Marcus wasn't fired, he was required to attend cultural sensitivity training and was removed from consideration for international business travel for at least a year. The company's HR department made it clear that his behavior reflected poorly on their organization and could have implications for their international client relationships. The social media accounts that Marcus had been building throughout his European vacation took months to recover from the negative attention. Many of his original followers unfollowed him after the incident, while the new followers who came for the controversy were often hostile and critical. Eventually, Marcus made the decision to completely rebuild his online presence, focusing on respectful travel content and cultural education, rather than boundary-pushing stunts and viral moments. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Marcus had to confront the fact that his approach to social media and travel had been fundamentally selfish, focused more on his own entertainment and validation than on genuine appreciation for the places and people he encountered. The incident with Guardsman Mitchell had forced him to examine his motivations and consider the impact of his actions on others. Over the following months, Marcus began volunteering with organizations that supported military veterans, partly as a way of giving back to the community he had disrespected, and partly because he wanted to better understand the experiences and sacrifices of people like the guard he had harassed. Through this work, he met several British military veterans living in the United States, and their stories helped him appreciate the serious nature of military service and the importance of showing appropriate respect. One of these veterans, a former member of the Welsh Guards named David, became a mentor and friend to Marcus. David had served alongside members of the Queen's Guard and helped Marcus understand the rigorous training, discipline, and dedication required for such prestigious positions. "Those lads aren't just pretty uniforms for tourists," David explained during one of their conversations. "They're elite soldiers who've earned their positions through years of hard work and sacrifice." Marcus also began studying British history and culture more seriously, developing a genuine appreciation for the traditions and institutions he had treated so casually during his visit to London. He learned about the role of the monarchy in British society, the history of the Royal Guards, and the cultural significance of ceremonies like the changing of the guard. This education helped him understand why his behavior had been so offensive to British observers, and why the response had been so swift and serious. The official consequences of Marcus's actions proved to have lasting effects. When he applied for a visa to visit the United Kingdom 2 years later for a friend's wedding, he was required to provide detailed explanations of the incident and undergo additional screening. While he was eventually approved for entry, the process took several months longer than usual and required documentation from the American embassy confirming that he had taken steps to address his past behavior. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus's experience became a teaching tool for other travelers. He began writing and speaking about cultural sensitivity and respectful tourism, using his own mistakes as examples of what not to do when visiting foreign countries. His apology video from that day in London had been viewed millions of times, and many people reached out to thank him for his honesty and willingness to learn from his mistakes. The incident also had an unexpected positive outcome in terms of Marcus's personal growth. The humiliation and consequences of his actions forced him to develop genuine empathy and cultural awareness that had been lacking in his earlier approach to travel. He became more thoughtful about the impact of his actions on others and more respectful of local customs and institutions wherever he traveled. Guardsman Mitchell, meanwhile, continued his distinguished service with the Coldstream Guards. His professional handling of the incident was noted in his service record as an example of proper protocol execution under challenging circumstances. The young soldier never spoke publicly about the confrontation, maintaining the dignity and discretion that were hallmarks of his military training. As Marcus reflected on the incident and its aftermath, he realized that while the experience had been deeply embarrassing and had genuine negative consequences, it had also been necessary for his personal development. The confident, boundary-pushing tourist who had approached that royal guard had needed to learn some hard lessons about respect, consequences, and the difference between entertaining content and appropriate behavior. The videos of that morning at Buckingham Palace would probably follow Marcus for the rest of his life, serving as a permanent reminder of a moment when his quest for social media attention had overcome his judgment and respect for others. But rather than trying to hide from this legacy, Marcus had chosen to embrace it as a teaching tool and a reminder to always consider the human cost of his actions. In the end, Marcus Thompson's confrontation with Guardsman Mitchell became more than just a viral video about a tourist who crossed the line. It became a story about growth, accountability, and the possibility of learning from our worst moments to become better people.